The first low rumbles reached me before I saw her slow, distant thunder rolling over the ridge, carrying with it a change in the air. The light turned the color of old copper sky, heavy with dust, the kind of weather that pushed even the stubbornest cattle back toward shelter. Down the trail, a figure swayed into view through the wavering heat, each step deliberate, like everyone cost her something she didn't have much left of. Barefoot rope at her waist, her dress clung to her in torn strips. She didn't falter when she saw me. She just stopped at the gate, hand resting on the rail, and spoke in a voice gone dry from wind and grit. "Just one night," she said. "Please. Before I tell you what happened after that, let me know where you're listening from in the comments and tap like and subscribe if you've ever stood at a moment when one choice could change everything. My name's Elias Boone, and I've worked this patch of land most of my life. My father settled here after the war, taught me that work was the only thing you could count on when seasons and people turned. We didn't have much, but what we had stayed in good repair, fences mended before they leaned, tools cleaned before they rusted. My mother kept the Sabbath strict, my father kept his word stricter, and between the two, I learned that doing right didn't need to be spoken about. We grew beans, kept chickens, cut wood when the nights hinted at frost. It was a lean life, but it was ours, and it ran on the kind of honesty that didn't come with papers or signatures. The town a few miles south was another world entirely. Calico flats ran on railroad schedules, freight wagons, and talk that turned to money faster than a poker table in the back of the saloon. Men there measured worth by the weight of a coin purse or the spread of land they'd claimed with the county clerk. Land speculators came through regular smiling as they asked after my acres, as if a man alone ought to trade his birthright for a stack of bills. I turned them all away. That was before the sickness took my wife and boy in the same week, before the graves out back turned me into a man who saw no reason to leave the fence line. The years after were quiet, measured out in the scrape of a hoe through dry soil, the rattle of wind against the windows, the whistle of a kettle on the stove. I stopped using words altogether, not from bitterness, but because the air in the house stayed lighter without them. No one came down the trail uninvited. Not until the evening I saw her step from the shimmer of heat like she'd been walking all the way from the horizon. She didn't cry, didn't beg beyond the first words. She stood there, steady eyes fixed, as if she'd already decided what she'd do if I said no. I unlatched the gate without speaking, and she walked past me toward the porch. Somewhere above us, the thunder-deepened wind shifting through the sage in long, tired breaths. Inside, the kettle was still warm, the fire banked low. I had not yet decided if I'd regret opening that gate, and as she set her bundle down on the step and looked toward the hills, I saw dust lifting far off in the distance, too faint to tell if it was the storm or someone following. Ruthie didn't speak again that night. She kept to the corner of the porch while the rain tapped against the tin arms, rapt, tight eyes fixed on the yard as though the dark might move. I set the tin cup of water in her hands and the blanket across her shoulders. She took them without a word, fingers trembling more now that she was still. The storm carried on until well past nightfall, the wind pushing at the shutters, the smell of wet earth rising from the yard. When the fire inside began to fade, I motioned her toward the cabin. She stepped past me, slow and stiff, tracking in the scent of rain and dust. I gave her the chair nearest the stove and set out a plate of beans with a wedge of bread from the day before. She ate without lifting her eyes, each bite measured as though she had learned long ago to pace herself. When she finished, she set the tin plate aside and sat with her hands folded, letting the heat of the stove reach her face. I rolled out my bed by the hearth and took my coat for a cover. She glanced toward the single bed, but didn't ask, didn't move toward it. By the time I lay down, the only sound was the pop of sap in the stove wood. Near midnight, I opened my eyes to see her awake, sitting on the edge of the bed, her hand resting on the doorframe, as if testing whether she could open it. When she noticed me watching, I reached for the spare blanket and slid it across the floor toward her. She took it, sat down beside the hearth, and wrapped it around her legs. That was how we slept, two people in the same room, each keeping enough space to feel safe. By morning, the rain had left the ground damp and the air sharp. I was up before the first light, same as always, moving quiet so as not to stir her. But before long, she stepped into the yard, barefoot, her dress stiff from drying overnight. She didn't touch the cup of water I'd set out, just crossed to the chicken coop and stood watching. I scattered feed, and after a moment, she took up the tipped sack and held it while I filled it again. She didn't wait for permission, didn't ask what needed doing. She simply followed when I walked the fence line, knelt to hold the spade when I dug out a broken post, and stood silent beside me when we found a rabbit caught in the wire. She helped bury it without turning her head away. We stopped at midday beneath the lone shade tree east of the house. I handed her cornbread and a strip of jerky. She chewed slow, as if reminding herself how to eat. That was when she finally spoke again, 2 words, quiet but clear. "Thank you." I nodded and let the silence return. A little while later, she told me her name. Ruthie. I kept my hands busy with the knife and branch I'd taken up that morning. She said she could help here, that she didn't need much in return. I didn't answer, but I didn't tell her no either. That evening, she swept the cabin corners, rinsed the tin cup, and folded the blanket neatly. I brought her a clean shirt from the back room, far too big, but better than what she had. She stepped behind the door to change, then sat by the hearth, combing her hair through with her fingers. "Is it just you here?" she asked. I nodded. "You don't talk much," she added. I kept my eyes on the fire. "People who talk too much usually want something," she said. "I've had enough of that." I stoked the fire, and she didn't press me further. Over the next day, she kept pace with me in the work without complaint. She told me a little of where she'd come from. Her folks died when she was 12, sickness taking most of the town. A preacher came through, gathered up a handful of children, and kept her longer than the rest. His house was quiet by his rules, and he made sure questions earned a harder hand than silence ever did. She didn't tremble as she spoke, but I noticed her hand shaking just enough to flatten it against the table. I went to the cupboard, brought out a patch of blue gingham, and set it in front of her. She understood. That morning, she mended her torn sleeve by the window while I worked the shed door. By late afternoon, we were both at the shed, her holding the boards while I drove the nails. She said she could do more than sweep. She'd tended chickens before, worked with a mule once, and she didn't scare easy. I pointed her toward the pen, and she set about collecting eggs, checking feed, and shooing a lazy hen from its nest with a soft chuckle. It was the first light sound I'd heard in this house in years. That night, she sat on the rug near the fire, patching the other's sleeve. I carved at a block of wood I hadn't touched in a long while. She asked me what his name was. I didn't answer, just handed her the small, rough shape of a horse. She held it, then asked if it was my boy's. I didn't need to say it was. She set it back in my hand and said she'd help with the roof come morning. I nodded. By the week's end, the cabin door stayed open during daylight. She'd taken to sweeping the porch each morning and starting the water for the day's cooking without being told. One morning, she found a mug on the table, roughly carved, her initials cut into the side. She didn't say anything, but she worked steady through the day, patching chicken wire, checking the grain, replanting onions gone dry. That evening, I brought her an old pair of my wife's boots. She laced them tight and gave me a single nod. We sat down to stew and bread that night. She told me I didn't have to keep fixing everything myself. I didn't answer, but I didn't turn away either. After supper, she nailed a loose shutter closed without being asked. Later, she asked if I missed them all the time. She said she thought she'd always miss hers, but some days were easier than others. I stepped outside and she followed. Together, we walked to the back ridge where a single grave marker stood. She went to it alone, knelt to place a fresh stone beside it, then came back without a word. That night I left the bed's extra quilt folded across the end. She slept there instead of the hearth, not because she'd asked, but because she wasn't a stranger anymore. The days took on their own rhythm. She rose before sunrise, swept the porch, fed the chickens, and started the fire while the light was still thin. I noticed how she handled each tool with care, never wasted, never broke. I left small things where she could find them, a pair of gloves, a bar of soap, a folded cloth. One morning, working the southern fence line, she asked if I wanted her to stay. She didn't say it like a plea, only as a question that needed an answer. I handed her a folded piece of canvas with coins inside and a list salt flower nails and a needle. She understood I was asking her to go into town for me, something I hadn't done in 5 years. She agreed without fuss. That night she studied the list by lamplight. She asked what to say if folks in town asked about me. I set her mug on the table and told her, nothing. It was the first word I'd spoken to her. Her shoulders eased and she nodded. At first light, she saddled the mule, tied the coins and list into a flour sack, and asked if I needed anything else. I gave her a tin with 2 buttons, a broken brooch, and a strip of ribbon. She understood without my explaining. I watched her ride out down the trail, boots kicking up dust, until she disappeared over the ridge. The yard felt still again, but I knew she'd be back. Somewhere beyond that ridge the town waited, and with it, whatever she thought she'd left behind. The ride into Calico Flats took most of the morning. From the ridge, Ruthie kept the mule steady, eyes forward, her patched dress brushing against the worn leather saddle. The air was clear but dry enough to sting, and each hoof step sent small curls of dust behind her. She didn't glance back toward the homestead, not once, though I watched from the porch until she was no more than a shape in the heat shimmer. By the time she reached the edge of town, the sun sat high, pressing hard on the rooftops. Calico Flats was no bigger than a single street flanked by 2 short alleys, the train depot at one end and the church at the other. Wagons lined the road in uneven rows, their wheels resting in ruts worn deep over the years. She tied the mule in front of the general store and brushed the trail dust from her skirt before stepping inside. The bell over the door announced her, drawing the eyes of the man behind the counter. He was thick through the shoulders, suspenders stretched over a sweat-darkened shirt, his hair pressed flat from a hat he hadn't put back on yet. Ruthie unfolded the canvas and set the list on the counter without ceremony. All of this, she said. He studied her face for a moment, then gave a small grunt and began to gather the items, flour salt nails, a needle, placing each on the counter with a dull thud. A pair of women lingered near the shelves, speaking low enough to make their words unclear, but their glances toward Ruthie were not. Another customer, a man in a vest too fine for the weather, looked her over as he pretended to check the canned goods. She counted out the coins, one by one, the metal clicking against the counter. Her voice steady as she told the storekeeper it was for Boone's place. That name slowed his hands. "He's still out there?" he asked. "He is," she answered. "Folks say he don't talk. He does," she said, "when it matters." That ended his questions. She stepped outside with the supplies bundled in the flour sack and had just started to tie it to the mule when a voice called her name. Ruthie Taylor. She froze, fingers tightening on the knot. The man crossing the street toward her wore a long brown coat despite the heat, the brim of his hat pulled low over a pale sun-creased face. His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Didn't expect to see you again," he said, stopping close enough that his shadow cut across her boots. She didn't turn fully toward him. "I'm not yours," she said. He laughed under his breath. "You think hiding behind that mute old man makes you safe? He can't even say your name." Her answer was to mount the mule, looking down at him without flinching. "Not ever again," she said, then nudged the mule forward. He stepped aside, watching her pass, the smile gone. She didn't look back. The trail home stretched long, the heat pressing from above and the scent of dry sage riding the air. By the time she reached the yard, I was working a whetstone over the edge of a spade. She set the sack of supplies on the porch and met my eyes. "He's coming," was all she said. I set the spade down, went inside, and reached for the cloth-wrapped bundle on the shelf above the hearth. Inside the bundle was an old single-shot rifle, oiled and kept clean despite years without use. I checked the sights, worked the lever, and laid out the cartridges on the table. She stood across from me, arms folded, her boots leaving faint marks in the dust on the floorboards. "I'm not running," she said. I nodded. The air between us shifted, not fear, but readiness. 3 days later, I saw the dust trail first. From the porch, it was no more than a pale ribbon rising along the old telegraph line, too thin for a wagon and too steady for a stray rider. Ruthie came to stand beside me without speaking. When the figure grew clear, the man's coat confirmed what she already knew. He rode into the yard with the kind of ease that said he'd rehearsed it in his mind. He swung down from the saddle dust, puffing around his boots, and looked over the cabin and the yard. "Looks worse than I figured," he said, voice aimed toward Ruthie. "You left without so much as a thank you. That's not how God teaches it." I stepped down from the porch. The rifle hung behind the door, but I didn't need it in my hands yet. "You're the silent one, then," he said, glancing at me. "She's mine. I fed her, gave her the word. That still counts for something." Ruthie stepped forward, her voice flat. "You don't own anything." His smile turned thin. "That man can't protect you. He's got a grave out back and nothing else." I spoke one word. "No." The sound stopped him for a moment. Ruthie looked at me sharply, not at the word itself, but at the way it carried. I stepped closer, slow but certain. I said no. I told him again. He held my gaze, his shoulders squaring, then let out a short scoff. "You can ride back to wherever you came from," Ruthie said, standing a few feet from him. "There's nothing for you here." He didn't answer right away, only studied her face for a moment longer before turning back to his horse. Without another word, he mounted and rode out the dust rising behind him until he was nothing but a speck against the hills. Ruthie stayed facing the trail until it was empty. When she turned toward me, her voice was quieter. "That was the first word I ever heard from you." I nodded once. She let out a long breath and stepped past me toward the cabin. Inside, the evening light spilled across the table, catching the curve of her carved mug and the folded quilt at the bed's foot. Outside, the yard settled into its old stillness, but it no longer felt like the same place. The preacher's dust trail had long since settled, but his visit stayed with us in the quiet that followed. Ruthie moved through the next morning's chores without pause, the hem of her dress brushing over the porch boards as she swept. I worked the east fence line, the cedar posts casting long shadows across the hard-packed ground. She joined me with a basket of eggs, setting it on the rail before helping steady a post while I drove the nails home. Neither of us spoke about him. There was no need. Still, I noticed the way she kept an eye toward the ridge from time to time, as if measuring the horizon. That afternoon, she mended a tear in the quilt by the window, her needle catching the light. I shaved down a new handle for the spade, the smell of fresh wood cutting through the dry air. 3 days passed before Ruthie mentioned town again. "We might need more feed by month's end," she said, tying back her hair before stepping into the yard. I nodded. The last trip had stirred trouble, but she didn't flinch from it. Instead, she turned her attention to repairing the latch on the chicken coop, setting each nail with even strokes. Late that evening, she carried in the wash, from the line her arms full of sun-dried cloth. "You should see this," she said, setting the bundle aside. I followed her to the porch. The sky was low with clouds, the air heavy enough to promise rain. But it wasn't the weather she was watching. A rider moved slow along the far trail, his figure a dark cut against the pale grass, not the preacher's smaller in the saddle hat brim pushed back. Whoever it was, he turned off before reaching the house, disappearing into the stand of mesquite that edged the old telegraph line. Ruthie lingered there even after the rider was gone. I could hear the faint creak of the porch boards under her weight. "Strange time for company," she said half to herself. I checked the rifle and set it back in its place before heading inside. She followed, shutting the door behind her. The next morning came gray and cool. We worked side by side in the shed, moving tools to patch the leak in the roof. As I hammered the last board into place, she asked, "Do you think he's coming back?" I knew she meant the preacher. "If he does," I said, "he'll find we're ready." She met my eyes for a moment, then nodded and went back to her work. That afternoon, we heard the faint clang of a hammer against metal, the sound carrying across the dry air. It wasn't coming from our place. Ruthie paused in the middle of chopping kindling, glancing toward the south. "Could be from Miller's old spread," she said. I hadn't heard that name in years. Miller had sold out before the railroad came, and the land had sat empty since. Whoever was there now had reason enough to work in plain daylight. 2 days later, a wagon rolled into the yard just after sunrise. The man on the seat was lean, his coat dusty, a hat pulled low over eyes that scanned the place without much hurry. He introduced himself as Caleb Morton. 42, said he was running freight between Calico Flats and the station to the west. He'd heard we might have extra eggs to sell. I didn't answer right away, but Ruthie stepped forward, asked what he was paying. His offer was fair. While she fetched the baskets, Morton glanced toward the ridge. "Saw a fellow riding this way a few days back," he said. Didn't wave, just kept on. I met Ruthie's eyes as she returned with the eggs. She thanked him for the trade, and he tipped his hat before turning the wagon toward the trail. After he'd gone, we stood for a while in the quiet yard. "Could have been anyone," she said. I nodded, though the thought stayed with me through the rest of the day. I repaired the gate hinge while she boiled water for laundry, both of us keeping one ear tuned to the distance. By week's end, the clouds had broken the air dry again. I found her in the small garden out back, turning the soil with the spade. "We could plant more onions," she said. "If we get them in before frost, they'll hold." I agreed and went to fetch the seed. As we worked, the wind shifted, carrying the faint sound of hoofbeats from the west. They faded before we could place them. That night, she set an extra log on the fire and checked the latch on the back door twice before sitting down with her sewing. I took the chair near the window, the lamplight catching the barrel of the rifle where it leaned. Outside, the moon lit the ridge in pale silver. Somewhere beyond it, the preacher might have been riding, or someone else entirely. When we turned in the air inside the cabin, felt close, heavy with the things neither of us had said. Morning would come, and with it, whatever shadow was edging nearer. 2 mornings after the wagon trade, Ruthie was already on the porch when I came from the shed. The sun was just clearing the ridge, the air holding the last bit of night's cool. She had the broom in hand, sweeping in steady strokes, the sound carrying into the yard. I set down the coil of rope I'd been mending and told her I was heading to the north fence. Without a word, she left the porch to walk alongside me. We found 2 posts leaning from the last wind. I worked the shovel into the ground while she held the boards straight, the dirt damp enough to cling to her boots. When the last nail was set, she glanced toward the trail that ran behind the mesquite stand. "Could be more riders," she said, not lifting her eyes from the line of fence. I tightened the nails with one more strike before moving us along. By midday, we were back at the cabin. She took the water bucket to the well, and I stayed to repair the latch on the shed door. The boards creaked under my weight as I leaned to fit the hinge, the smell of dry cedar thick in the air. From the corner of my eye, I saw her pause at the well, scanning the distance beyond the ridge before drawing the bucket. That evening, Ruthie set about baking the small round of bread we'd planned for the next day's meal. I stoked the fire to keep the coals hot, the stove iron radiating steady heat into the room. As the bread cooled, she fetched the folded list from its place on the shelf. "We'll need to go into town again soon," she said. I kept my gaze on the firebox. She smoothed the paper between her fingers. "It doesn't have to be me," she added. I looked at her then, but said nothing. The next day was given over to chores that kept us closer to the cabin. She patched the feed sacks, and I split enough wood to last through the week. In the late afternoon, she came from the porch, with her hair damp from the basin, the loose ends curling at her shoulders. "I'll check the traps along the west gully," she said, taking up the small canvas bag we used for carrying back any catch. I joined her, and together we walked the narrow path through the sage. Only one trap held anything a rabbit limp in the wire. She freed it, wrapped it in cloth, and we turned for home. We had just reached the yard when the sound of hoofbeats came from the east trail. Not hurried, but steady. Ruthie moved to stand near the porch rail while I stepped into the open waiting. The rider came into view, a man I didn't know, clean-shaven, coat buttoned despite the heat. He reined in a few yards from the porch, giving his name as Silas Danner, 38, a cattle buyer from 2 towns over. Said he'd heard there might be grazing land available and thought to ask before the railroad men moved in. I told him the land wasn't for sale. He didn't argue, only nodded and tipped his hat. "If you change your mind, you'll find me in Jackson Flats till the month's end," he said. With that, he turned his horse and rode off the way he'd come. Ruthie stayed by the rail until he was gone, then looked to me. "That's 2 visitors in less than a week," she said. I nodded once and went inside. For the next few days, we kept to our work, but stayed mindful of the trails. Ruthie began keeping the rifle closer at hand, leaning it by the door when she came in from outside. On the 4th morning, I found her already out back mending the chicken wire with the pliers from my toolbox. "Figured I'd save you the trouble," she said without looking up. I stood watching for a moment before taking the other end of the wire to help pull it taut. That night after the lamps were out, the cabin held a different kind of stillness. It wasn't the quiet of rest, but of listening. Sometime past midnight, the faint clink of metal reached us from beyond the ridge. Ruthie's eyes met mine across the dark, both of us hearing it. Neither of us spoke. The sound faded, but the wakefulness stayed. At first light, we set to the day's tasks, though both of us kept glancing toward the ridge. By mid-morning, the wind shifted, bringing with it the smell of wood smoke from somewhere too far to see. I checked the rifle, cleaned the barrel, and laid it within easy reach on the table. Ruthie brought in the wash and began folding it, the fabric whispering in her hands. The day passed without another sound from beyond the ridge. But when the sun dropped low, the air took on that charged stillness that comes before change. I latched the door early, and Ruthie set the last log in the stove. We ate in near silence, both of us aware of the unsettled space just outside our walls. When we turned in, I kept my coat folded on the chair nearest the door boots beside it. Ruthie set the rifle across the table close enough to reach without crossing the room. Whatever was moving closer, we would hear it before it reached the yard. The morning started with a sharp wind coming off the ridge, carrying the smell of smoke again, though faint and scattered. Ruthie was already at the porch rail, mug in hand, watching the trail beyond the mesquite stand. I joined her without a word, eyes tracing the bend where the track disappeared behind the low hill. The ground there was marked with new hoof cuts, edges still crisp from the night before. After breakfast, we set to the work. We had planned a run of repairs on the south fence where 2 rails had splintered. She hauled the fresh boards from the stack by the shed, and I fit them in place, the ring of the hammer carrying far in the thin air. When we stopped for water, she glanced toward the ridge again. "Could be more than one camp out there," she said. I didn't answer, but I'd been thinking the same. By midday, the sun had burned off the last of the morning chill. Ruthie went to check the garden, her skirt catching on the corner of the coop as she passed. I stayed by the fence, cutting back the brush that had grown too close. A shadow crossed over the ground, and I looked up to see a hawk wheeling high overhead, riding the air without a sound. It was near evening when the first sign came. A lone rider eased out from behind the ridge, keeping his pace slow as though he didn't want to spook the livestock. He rode past the split in the trail that led to our place, not turning in, but I could see him studying the yard as he passed. Ruthie had stepped out onto the porch by then, wiping her hands on her apron. We both watched until the figure was gone behind the stand of cottonwoods. That night, we kept the lamps low. Ruthie set the rifle on the table within easy reach. I checked the latches twice before settling into the chair near the window. Outside, the wind shifted, sending the faint clink of metal through the dark. It wasn't close, but it carried. The next morning, Ruthie suggested we ride out a mile to check the far fence. I saddled the mule and we took the trail east, the sun warm on our backs. Half a mile out, we found fresh tracks, 2 sets of horse prints, one lighter, one heavier, cutting across the trail toward the ridge. She crouched to look closer. "Not from Morton's wagon," she said. "Too far off his route." We followed the prints to where they broke off into rocky ground, the trail disappearing among the stones. From there, the land opened wide to the west, nothing to see but sage and the shimmer of heat. We turned back, neither of us saying much on the ride home. That afternoon, while Ruthie mended a tear in the feed sack, I went to the shed for the small chest I kept under the workbench. Inside was a box of cartridges wrapped in oilcloth and a length of rawhide for making a strap. I set to work fitting the strap to the rifle, the leather creaking under the pull of my hands. She didn't ask why. She just kept stitching. By the time the sun dipped low, the yard had taken on that quiet weight it sometimes gets before weather or trouble. Ruthie moved through the last of the chores with quick efficiency, gathering eggs, sweeping the porch, and bringing in the bucket from the well. I checked the sky clear, but the wind carried a faint murmur from the west, too distant to place. We ate supper with the door latched, the sound of the stove ticking as it cooled. After the plates were cleared, she stood at the window, looking out toward the trail. "If they're circling, they'll show again before week's end," she said. I set my coat on the chair beside the door boots, lined up underneath. The rifle rested against the wall. The new strap looped over the stock. When we turned in, the night was still, but the kind of still that made every creak of the cabin board sound sharper. Morning would bring work as always, but both of us knew the ridge was holding something back. Whatever it was coming closer. By the 4th morning after we'd spotted that lone rider, the air carried the smell of horses before I even stepped outside. Ruthie was already at the table, lacing her boots tight, the rifle leaned within easy reach. I poured the last of the hot water into the tin basin and set it aside. She didn't speak, but when she stood, I saw the way her shoulders set steady and squared. We moved through the morning chores without hurry. She gathered eggs and fed the chickens. I split a few more logs for the woodpile. By mid-morning, the yard fell quiet. Even the hens stayed close to the coop, as though they knew something waited beyond the fence line. That was when I heard the distant rhythm of hooves, too slow for freight, too measured for a drifter passing through. Ruthie came out from the shed, wiping her hands on her apron. We stood side by side at the porch rail, watching the trail where it cut down from the ridge. The rider appeared just past the mesquite, a man in a dark coat, the brim of his hat pulled low. He didn't rush. When he reached the yard, he dismounted with deliberate slowness, dust settling around his boots. It was the preacher. His eyes moved over the place, pausing on the coop, the woodpile, the well, taking stock like it was his own. "You've made yourself comfortable," he said, glancing toward Ruthie. She didn't answer. I stepped down from the porch, my coat open, my hands still and loose at my sides. He looked me over, the corner of his mouth twisting. "You think one word's enough to keep me away? She's mine by God's claim." I met his eyes. "She's not yours." My voice was even low enough that it made him take a step closer to hear it. Ruthie moved then, coming down the steps until she was even with me. "You can turn around and leave," she said. "This is not your ground." His jaw worked as if he was chewing over his reply. "I took her in when no one else would," he said. "Fed her, kept her. That don't just go away." I took another step forward, closing the space between us until the dust from his boots reached mine. "It's gone," I said. He didn't like that. His shoulders tightened, his fingers brushing the hem of his coat like he might reach for something. Ruthie didn't flinch. For a long moment, none of us moved. The only sound was the faint rattle of the windmill turning slow in the distance. Then he broke it with a short, bitter laugh. "Not worth my time," he said, stepping back toward his horse. He mounted in one smooth motion, turned the animal toward the trail, and rode off without looking back. We watched until the shape of him disappeared into the heat haze. Ruthie stayed facing the ridge even after the trail was empty. When she finally turned to me, her voice was steady. "That's the last time he rides in here." I nodded once. The rest of the day passed in a quiet that felt different, lighter in some places, heavier in others. She cleaned the rifle and set it back in its place by the door. I checked the fence lines again, walking the perimeter until the sun was low. That evening, she sat by the hearth with her sewing, the lamplight catching in her hair. I carved at a small block of wood, shaping it without thinking. When she looked up, her eyes went to the mug. I'd made her weeks before, sitting on the shelf. "This doesn't feel like hiding anymore," she said. I didn't answer, but I set the carving aside and rested my hand on the edge of the table near hers. She didn't take it, but she didn't move away either. Outside, the sky deepened from violet to black. 2 white stones stood side by side behind the house, pale in the moonlight. Whatever came next, we'd face it here. The days after the preacher's departure settled into a steadier rhythm. The mornings came cool, with light just touching the ridge before spilling across the yard. Ruthie was usually first to the porch, broom in hand, moving in slow, sure strokes while the chickens scratched at the packed dirt. I'd join her with the bucket for the well, and together we'd work through the day's chores as if they'd always been ours to share. The air in the cabin felt different now. The door stayed unlatched in daylight, and sometimes in the evening we'd let the wind carry through while the stove warmed the room. Ruthie kept the mug I'd carved for her on the shelf above the table. She used it every morning, rinsed it every night, placing it back in its spot like it belonged there. One afternoon, while I was repairing the hinge on the shed door, she came around the corner with a folded length of cloth in her hands. It was the quilt she'd mended weeks before now, stitched with a new square of blue gingham. "For the bed," she said simply, setting it over the rail to air. The wind caught the edges, lifting them toward the sun. We saw riders from time to time along the far trail, freight wagons, ranch hands moving cattle, the occasional drifter heading toward the flats, but none turned in. The ridge felt like a boundary now, one that needed no marker. Whatever claim the preacher thought he had was gone. As the season edged toward fall, we turned the garden beds and laid in extra wood. Ruthie took to checking the fence lines on her own, coming back with her apron full of kindling or her hands carrying a bundle of sage. I fixed the roof over the coop, and she lined the nesting boxes with fresh straw. The work was steady, but it was more than work. It was the making of a place together. One evening we stood out back as the sun dropped low, the ridge turning gold before the light faded. 2 white stones caught the last of it side by side in the grass. Ruthie stepped closer, placing a small sprig of wildflowers between them. She didn't say anything, and neither did I, but we both stayed there until the shadows pulled long across the yard. That night, with the lamps low and the fire banked, Ruthie sat at the table stitching by the light. I sanded the edges of a new carving, the shape of it still rough. The sound of the wind in the eaves was the only thing between us. After a while, she set down her needle. "We're not alone out here," she said softly. "Not anymore." I met her eyes and nodded. She was right. Life on the frontier didn't often give you what you wanted. But sometimes it gave you exactly what you needed, just not in the way you expected. We hadn't gone looking for each other, but we'd found the kind of belonging you can't bargain for. If you've ever had a place or a person turn from a refuge into a home, you'll understand what I mean. And if you have, I'd like to hear your story.